see on the screen behind me with a very colorful slide. It looks like everybody had to cover many colors on that slide, doesn't it? But we're starting at Exodus chapter 22. And if you're following along in your study guide, it's toward that last full paragraph at the bottom of page 48, where he begins to talk about laws concerning protection of property. And so all of these things that we see in these next few chapters are generalized, not generalized, but general statements based on what? What are they an expansion of? The Ten Commandments, right? And so as we have the Ten Commandments, we looked at those in particular on Wednesday evening briefly, as we looked at those Ten Commandments, and we kind of, divided those into two parts. The first four specifically deal with God himself, and the last six deal with how mankind deals with one another and what God expects of us. But those are not specific in nature. God goes on to reveal to Moses in these next chapters, as we have learned, something a little more specific, but he doesn't get into finite detail about all of what he has to say even in these chapters. For example, in chapter 23, I believe it is, he refers to the law of the virgin. And so he doesn't specifically state what that law is until later on, but he does make that clear later on to them. And so we've gone from kind of a shotgun blast, if you will, just a scattering of the main points of the Ten Commandments down to something a little more specific. And then even as we go on through Leviticus, he'll be much more specific about the particular laws that he's mentioning here. So if there's something as we go along and he mentions something like, say, the law of the virgin, and we don't necessarily know what that is, then that will be explained a little bit later on. So don't be too concerned about that. Don't be too confused if you have forgotten those things, or if this is the first time maybe you're studying that specifically, just recognize that those will come along a little bit later. All right, so where are we geographically speaking in our study?
At Sinai.
Okay, it's Sinai. Also called what? Horeb, right. That's right. So in the wilderness of sin in Sinai, or Mount Horeb, and he begins to talk about in the first portion of chapter 22, property rights. And again, we go back to animals and animal theft and laws about animals. How important were animals to the people of Israel at this time? Yes, they are. They're key to their existence. They're key to their worship. And so they have been blessed greatly as a result of those things. And from the days of Abraham, they've been shepherds, right? And so even in the land of Egypt, when Jacob and his family came down to meet Joseph, they had animals with them. And so they're very important. And so it's recognizable that God would, and understandable that God would specify laws concerning animals. And he begins to talk about theft of animals. We discussed on Wednesday evening, an aggressive animal, one that would gore, an ox that might be given to gore people and what would happen with that. But now he talks about the theft of animals like that. So a stolen ox or a sheep, either sold or killed, would have to be replaced. And whoever did that, when they were caught, they would replace, the stolen ox by what? 5 head of cattle, right. So when an oxen was stolen, it was found out, then that person that did that would have to replace it with 5 head. In regard to the sheep, if the sheep was stolen, how many would it have to be replaced with? 4. And so that's a pretty stiff penalty, isn't it? For, as we look upon things, it's not just like for like. It's 5 of oxen and 4 of sheep. And so that was a great deterrent for theft. And so if a person decided that he wanted to steal that particular animal, then he needed to know that he would have to come back with much more than what he stole. What is inherent, while I'm thinking about that, what is inherent when one desires to steal something? What other sin is involved in that?
Covetousness.
Covetousness, that's right. And so we see, we may pass King's Ranch or something. We see this, cattle spread out everywhere, and we think, well, he won't miss one of them. So we decide to steal. That's coveting. And it's also theft, of course, when the act is committed. The death of a thief caught while breaking in, if one was breaking into, say, the sheepfold, or if he's breaking into the pasture, or if he's breaking into some type of booth or barn or something where the oxen were kept, or just the field, then he would be put to death. Or if he wasn't, let me say this, let me make this clear. Some of my notes don't jog my memory like they should. But if he's caught breaking in and he's put to death by the owner, then there's no penalty for that, because he received his due. And trying to steal, if he was killed for some reason or another in the process of that, then no blood guiltiness, as some of your translations say, would be required. If he is attacked while let me put it this way, if the owner is protecting his animals or whatever his possessions are, and the thief is injured, and he makes it until sunrise, then he shall pay for his theft. And if he can't pay for his theft, what's to happen to him? Sorry?
Becomes a slave.
Yes, becomes a slave, sold as a slave. And so, as well as pay double if the animal is found alive in his own possession. So if the animal is there and he's got possession of it, then he's to pay double for that. So again, a stiff penalty if one was caught with the theft of an animal. Now we go from that back to kind of where we were in chapter 21, talking about animal trespassing. Animal trespassing has to do with, an animal getting out and going into another's property and doing damage. So that's what he talks about here. If there's a field or a vineyard of another that's eaten by one's beast, the best of one's field or vineyard is to be given as restitution. And it might be that, the animal is caught over in the edge of the field or the edge of the vineyard or something of that nature, where it's not as likely to be as prosperous as it might be over in the middle of the field, where there's a great deal of pollination going on and all that kind of stuff. And so that would not necessarily be the landowner's best crop. But the penalty for that was the best. Whatever the best was that owner of that beast had, he was to give that. And so this kind of touches on a law that we have in the New Covenant, where we are to consider others better than ourselves. And so if we were to, for example, borrow something from another, and then while in our possession, whatever it was, whether it was a tool or whether it was, an animal, and we'll talk about that in a minute, a little more, if something happened to that so that it was not usable anymore, should we go over to maybe Facebook Marketplace or the flea market or something and try to replace that? If we are, listening to the attitude here in the Ten Commandments and recognizing that, we're not under this law, but understanding the character of God and what He requires of His children, then we would go and buy a new one, wouldn't we? place that. So I think that should be paramount in our minds as we think about these things. We need to make some kind of, illustration and application to how we live today. Restitution is required for fire damage to another's grain field. So if I'm out burning and my fire gets over into my neighbor's property, then I need to pay restitution for that. Stored possessions. If a neighbor stores money or possessions for a person, and the thief that steals it is found, he shall pay double. And so here's a neighbor, say that you don't have a place to store what you have, and so the neighbor does, and the neighbor agrees to store it for you, and so you take it up there, but there's a thief that breaks in. And the thief takes what is yours, not what's your neighbor's, but he takes what's yours while it's in your neighbor's care. Well, if the thief is found, then he is to pay double for that. If the thief gets away, then the neighbor shall be brought before God, which is, when we see in these chapters that a person is to be brought before God, it's before the judges that have been set up by Moses and God to hear these things. And not necessarily would it have been those that Jethro would have suggested, or it was the thing that Jethro suggested to Moses that he set up others to help him rule the people. And so there would have been a similar type situation here where there would have been judges set up, and they would go before the judge, and the judge would inquire intently to see whether indeed the neighbor was actually the thief. And so there would be a statement made by the neighbor, and then the judges would discern that. How do you do that? How do you have a man come before you and make a statement or make a promise before God that he didn't steal something? Now, how do you judge whether he's telling the truth or not? How did these guys do that? How did these judges do that, Scott?
Well, short of being an eyewitness, you just have to conclude in the context, and the person's previous character comes into view. And as a parent does, you have to make a decision based on all the totality and hope you're right. Most of the time you will be right, but there are occasions where you may be wrong, and the person has made a mess of his life, and now he has no credibility, and maybe this time he's innocent, but now it's like, no, we've watched you for years, and you're a scoundrel, and you're known to do these kind of things, so there's a consequence there, but in general, you just have to be honest, right, and weigh it out.
Okay, all right.
It says that he has to prove his innocence. So there's going to be some evidence taken evidently in the case also.
Right. George?
I would just say, goodness, my train ran out of the station. A person's reputation has a lot to do with how he's judged, I would say. I think that's part of what you covered, but if a fellow has a good reputation and he says he didn't do it, you pretty well would listen to him. But you take a fellow that's been guilty before of other things sort of building up to that. But that's what a jury does.
That's right. Okay, let's hold that thought for just a minute as we go into the next discussion. So in regard to any theft that comes about, any complaint made against a party by another for something lost or stolen would also go before these judges, okay? And now then, an oath has to be made. Let's look at verse 11. I want to go back to, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but let's look at verse 9 first. For every breach of trust, whether it is for ox, for donkey, for sheep, for clothing, for any lost thing about which one says, this is it, the case of both parties shall come before the judges, he whom the judges confirm shall pay double to his neighbor. So in this case, this theft, the judges again discern what's going on, who stole it, who hasn't, who's innocent, who's guilty. And so the condemned party would have to pay double. Now, in verse 10, he says, if a man gives his neighbor a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or an animal to keep for him, and it dies or is hurt or is driven away while no one is looking, an oath before the Lord shall be made by the two of them, that he has not laid hands on his neighbor's property, and its owner shall accept it, and he shall not make restitution. So here it becomes a little more, important that the oath is made. So what are we talking about here when he makes an oath? He's standing before God, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's standing before God's adjudicators, if you will, the judges, and he's confirming with an oath that he's not guilty of this theft. So here we go a little step further in this process where this man is having to stand before God and confess this oath if he is not guilty. Now the seriousness of this is that if he lies to God, it will obviously be made known. And so that gives us a little more idea about this process here that goes on. And we're not told that in every case an oath is made. So there are some cases that an oath would be made, some cases where they would not be made, perhaps. But here the seriousness of this oath is that I'm standing here before God. I'm essentially promising that I have not done this. And I'm saying this to God, not just those that are around me. Scott, and then Dustin.
Yeah, I think in the case of the oath will suffice because in the context, the man has some measure of trust in the other guy. He's keeping his animal for him,
Right.
not a complete stranger. And so in this case, it's not you've been caught stealing or you're suspected of stealing it. So what God is saying basically is you had some measure of trust in the guy, and if he's telling you he didn't do it, and he's willing to stand up for really the world and God.
Yes.
But it doesn't apply. I don't see that oath in other cases where we have thievery involved or malicious abandonment or anything.
Right.
Foolishness.
And even in verse 9, it's talking about a breach of trust. Here you've got two people that, one's keeping an ox or has something to do with some of their animals somehow or another. And so there's a breach of trust there. So it's important that we recognize that these are two people in this case and in the next case that have an acquaintance. And they rely upon one another, and they've come to trust one another. So when that trust is breached, then there has to be an accounting for it. And again, that would make it an easier decision to make, if they knew one another and trusted one another. Dustin?
I was just going to say that's carried forward in that. If you go into a court system, one of the first things that you do, you take a stand, you put your hand on the Bible, you say that you're going to tell the truth. You are in the high office of the land. You put your hand on the Bible as you take that oath of office.
Right.
And that's very important in your society.
Yeah, that's right. George?
Yeah, I was going to bring up the thing about, I guess that's where, like you just said about the swearing on the Bible is supposed to be equivalent to what they went through. But I would think, people they perjure themselves all the time. But back then, I think it would be found out and they would really suffer punishment.
Right.
Man doesn't respect God like these people would do. I mean, there are probably some people who wouldn't, but as a majority, the people they'd think twice when they made an oath before God.
Right. And even in cases today when someone perjures themselves, it's easy, especially if they like to talk. If they like to talk more than they like to listen, you give them enough rope, they're going to perjure themselves, and they're going to tell on themselves eventually.
Right.
And so it's truth and error are so diametrically opposed that it's going to be obvious after a period of time.
Yeah.
Okay. So he goes on and says, if it is stolen, he must make restitution. And the law for that really has already been established back in the first few verses, where 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. So that would be included here in this restitution, I believe. Torn by beast, evidence is brought forth, no restitution is to be made if that particular animal was had gotten out and was torn by a beast. Okay, verse 14 and 15. If a man borrows anything from his neighbor, and it is injured or dies while its owner is not with it, he shall make full restitution. If the owner is with it, he shall not make restitution. If it is hired, it came for its hire. And so that's like, today we might take let's say, for example, we might take a piece of equipment or something to another's house to do some work. If we're there doing that work and we're getting paid for that work, and if that equipment breaks down, then that's on us, isn't it? It's our equipment, we're using it to make money with. So the same here. If the neighbor goes with his donkey and he's over there tilling the ground for his neighbor, and the donkey steps on a stone or something, injures his hoof, then that's on the owner. But if the owner's not present and the neighbor is using that animal and it comes to injury or something of that nature, or gets lost or whatever, then he shall make full restitution for that. All right, so I was wrong about chapter 23. It's chapter 22, wasn't it, concerning the law of the virgin. And so here we talk about other various laws, but this specifically deals with a man enticing a virgin, and she's not betrothed. She's simply just a maid, and he entices her to lie with her. He shall take her to wife and pay a dowry. Now, we don't know what the virgin's dowry is yet because we haven't studied that. So that's some of those things that we've talked about. We're going to learn about that a little bit later on. And so if the father refuses to allow his daughter to be married to this fellow, and I wouldn't blame him for that if he did. Here's a man that's taken her by force, essentially enticed her. He shall pay the dowry anyway. Now, there is something of consideration, I would think, as a father that I have to think about in that case. If my daughter was done that way, I've got 2 options, don't I? I've got to give her to the man as wife, or I've got to keep her, and now she's no longer a virgin. So that makes it difficult for her.
Yes.
But I might think about my daughter a little differently than the men thought about their daughters in that day and time. So there's another consideration to be taken in. I'm glad I'm not in that position. So that would have been very difficult, at least from where I stand today in the 21st century. That would be a very difficult decision to make. And I'm sure it was for the father as well, because he knew what would happen. He knew what would result. I mean, it's very likely the daughter would never be married because she was no longer a virgin. Sorcerers, beasts, etc. A witch or a sorcerer shall not live. You remember that time when King Saul went to the witch?
Which is in the word.
To talk to her about, wanting to see Samuel, wanting to talk to him. It is obvious that this woman was known, and he was able to obtain her services. But under the law, she was to be put to death. And so there's a combination of sins there on behalf of King Saul. To lie with a beast carnally carries the death penalty. Idolatry is punishable by death. So God had, in the very second commandment, said, "You shall make no graven images before me." And he's specific in telling them again here, if you worship or bow down to an image, then what's the penalty?
Yeah.
The penalty is death. And so he reminds them of that again, and that is a very, very serious thing. And when he talks about Israel and Judah later on in the divided kingdom as being adulterers and committing adultery, he's talking about them and their idolatry there, because they're worshiping and giving their homage to something else rather than him. Not that they weren't guilty of the other as well. And what we see through these pages that we're studying right now over and over again as well, not just the graven image and bowing down to that, but mistreating sojourners. We go back to the days of Abraham when the three men stood afar off and Abraham saw them coming at the door of his tent, and he rushed to prepare for them. He wanted to give them hospitality. And I believe it's Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4 that tells us to be careful to entertain strangers, because we may entertain angels unaware, just as Abraham did at that particular time. And so the sojourners, the people that were traveling, the people that were staying with you for a short period of time, the people that were alien to their land, were to be treated fairly, because he says, I want you to remember Egypt and when you were there. Remember the time you spent down there and how you were mistreated at the hand of Pharaoh and his people. And so do not mistreat sojourners. Widows and orphans. Here, if one afflicts a widow or an orphan, and let me just pause and say, I think we can all agree that's the lowest blow, to afflict a widow and an orphan. God said, if they cry to me, I'm going to hear them. And you know what's going to happen. He said, insinuate, you know what's going to happen if I hear them, don't you? I'm going to, if you're guilty, I'm going to kill you with a sword. And then whose wife and whose children will be a widow and an orphan? So let's be very careful about that. And so even today, the church has been given instructions about how to take care of the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. So we need to see that as it continues on as a commandment to us today. Lending. If you lend to the poor of you, that is, poor of your nation, the poor of Israel, you're not to charge them interest. I don't mean to fabricate or maybe cause a false idea to be carried on and passed on. But we do know those in our past history who would consider themselves God's people, themselves Jewish people, and they were very, very, very wily in business matters. And so they really knew how to squeeze that dollar and make those cents of interest come out. And so it is even today, not just with Jewish people, but with many others. I was looking at something the other day at Sam's, and you all know my hearing's not what it ought to be. I was over there at the counter where the hearing aids work. And so I was looking at these hearing aids and looked like, I think maybe a set was like $1,400 or something like that. And they were going to finance them, and that finance charge was going to be almost 15%.
Whoa.
And I know there's usury laws, and supposedly in the state of Alabama, if anything's $2,000 and under, supposedly you can't charge more than 11 or 12% interest. Anything above that is negotiable. And Albie could probably speak to this more so than me. There are specific laws about pawn shops and gun stores and stuff like that, and I'm not going to get into all that business. The point I'm making is this. There's a way of making a living without charging exorbitant rates of interest. And so it is here, especially with our own people. Now, I don't have an idea in my head that any of us would charge the rest of us an exorbitant rate of interest. More than likely, we would wind up saying, if you need this possession, if you need this, just take it. Just take it. There's not even going to be a loan connected with it. So that's what he's trying to get across here. When you're lending, be fair. Be fair with the people. Be fair with your brethren. If he gives you his garment as a pledge, or what we would refer to as earnest money or security, give it back to him before sundown. Because that's all he's got. That's his covering. That's what he sleeps in. And obviously, this is talking about those that are poor and have very little. He's going to have something to keep him warm tonight. Give it to him before sundown. This is his only covering. And if he cries to me, I'm going to hear him. And so, as we think about those types of things which involve money and possessions and all of that, this is not our time to gouge. This is our time to be humble and recognize that we've been blessed and be able to share. Scott, you have your hand?
Which shows God's character, going back to the Old Testament, how he cares for the low-off, the person that's hurting. In the New Testament, when he talks about being a stumbling block, you hurt any one of these little ones of mine, you better have a millstone. He's serious about taking advantage, especially of the people who are already hurting. That seems to really anger him. Right. And you're going to get tenfold back. You're going to wish you had never done that. And I like that. I really like that. And I remember, I probably said this before, when my little kids were little, and one of them was being mean to the other one just unnecessarily, boy, that angered me quick. I wasn't having that. And that's the worst thing you could commit in front of your dad. If I saw that, you were going to get it bad. It's one thing to just bicker. But if it was pure meanness and harming someone else, and it's just a terrible thing. So we know that God sees that. So we can be confident in lowering ourselves. Become that. Like he says, I will lift you up. If you make yourself big, you're going to get chopped down. If you make yourself low, I've got you covered. That's what I want. So it just shows his character consistently throughout.
Right. That's right. George, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I believe in the latter part of Acts, Paul talks about a statement that Jesus made to him that says it's more blessed to give than to receive. And James chapter 1 verse 27 says, pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God and Father is to visit the orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Got a big responsibility there.
Yes.
And that's, think back in 1 Timothy chapter 6, talking about the people that are well off, that they, do things that would store up treasure in heaven. All that stuff works together. So
yes.
There's a reward in that, whether one might think so or not.
Yes. That's right. And let me just pause to say that my time here with you, brethren, has shown me that you're very, very generous, and I appreciate that in every one of you. If you have, you're willing to share, you're willing to communicate, and I appreciate that. I just want to make that statement. Okay, as we go on, he talks about cursing and withholding. There shall be no cursing of God or a ruler, like some of these judges that we've been talking about here. If you go before that judge and that judge does not render a verdict that you would like, you dare not curse that judge. You dare not curse that judge, because God will hear. Do not withhold or delay your offering from harvest and wine presses. And I just have to wonder in this context if this doesn't also have to do with the fact that maybe we get a judgment against us and we're going to have to restore maybe the best of our crops because we let a fire get out, or we let a beast get out, or something of that nature. God says, don't withhold that from me. What is due to me is beyond what is due to your neighbor because of something that you did. And so you can't skimp back. It kind of reminds me about our giving today. You know, well, I've gone out and bought this new car, so I can't give anything to the Lord on Sunday. Well, what kind of judgment is that? What kind of thinking is that, you know? Oh, I've got this mortgage, it's real big now, and I can't give to the Lord because I got to pay my mortgage. You got to pay my debts. You know, the Christians got to pay their debts. Well, our first debt's to the Lord, isn't it? Amen. Okay. All right, so speaking myself here just as much as anyone. Okay, the law of the firstborn. As he closes out chapter 22, he talks about the firstborn of sons belonging to the Lord. Firstborn of sons belonging to the Lord. Now we see that literally in the life of Samuel, don't we? He was given to the Lord. He was given to Eli the priest to work with him. And we'll get into that story a little bit later on as we study, perhaps, Lord willing. But here, when we talk about the firstborn of sons belonging to the Lord, are all the firstborns given to the Lord for his work or whatever? What's he talking about there? Is there a redemption plan? There is a redemption, isn't there? And so God is claiming the firstborn that opens the womb from men and beasts. And so there is a redemption involved in that. And he goes on to talk about that here in just a minute. The firstborn of oxen and sheep shall be given to God on the 8th day. Stays with its mother 7 days. On the 8th day it's given to God. Now later on, I don't know how all this worked here, but later on we know that those would go to the priest. And so it might very well be that those animals at this particular time went to the judges because they were busy judging all day long and were not able to work and provide for themselves. Note that that's the case. He doesn't tell us particularly in this section whether that's the case or not. But no flesh that is torn by beasts shall be eaten. It is unholy to do so, and so it is to be discarded. Any beast that's torn by, or any flesh that's torn by beasts shall be eaten. No flesh that is torn by beasts shall be eaten. It is unholy to do so. Okay. Any questions or comments about 22 before we move on? Yes, Scott.
I thought right there at the end about those last three items. Kind of makes me wonder if that's a shadowing of Levi's story as well. Instead of, we don't know. It doesn't say that.
Right. Right. But that was in all through God's desire for sacrifices and those types of things. That was put up in the very forefront of their minds that they would have to do this. And so there would be some preparation involved. It's not like we do things today, oh, I'll just run down to the store at the last minute. No, that's not what they did. They prepared and they gave the best of the best when it was due. And so that might be another reason why he goes back and says, do not withhold from me. Good point.
It also speaks to starting a dependence on him.
Yes.
Forging that relationship.
You know, and as we go through and learn more about these sacrifices that are to be made, we realize how wealthy the people of Israel had to be in order to be able to keep up with these sacrifices and provide for themselves and provide for others that were poor. And you've got we'll talk about it in a little bit, you've got the 6 days, or 6 years rather, of harvest, and then the 7th year is that year when the land lies fallow. And so you've got to prepare for that. And in thinking about that, and going back to the idea of preparing for the famine in the days of Joseph, what did he do? He prepared, he stored up. And so there would have been a necessity of storing up for that. And so the one that was slothful and waited till the end of the 6th year and thought, oh, I forgot. You know, that didn't work out. That didn't work out. All right, so we'll go to Exodus chapter 23 and we talk about Sabbath, the land, and various feasts. He begins this chapter by talking about false witnesses. And after having laid down the procedure for all of these things that could have happened in regard to men and theft and beasts and damage and fire and damage and all that kind of stuff, he begins to state specifically how important it is to be a true witness. The sins of the false witness were many. First of all, obviously, is spreading a false report. A lie. Joining hands, perhaps, with a wicked man in doing that. Here's a man, he knows he's guilty. His axe, not his axe, but his ox has gored another. And he knew that this ox was often wanting to gore. He didn't put him up. And so what he does is he goes and he gets him a false witness. And so here we've got a wicked man joining hands with a false witness and vice versa. So being a malicious witness, false witness, a falsehood, a lie is also malicious because you know it's not the truth. It is damaging to others that are righteous. Taking part with many to do evil. Here we've got the majority idea. You know, how it is that, the majority, I'll go along with the majority. There's strength in the majority, and maybe if indeed the majority is wrong, then I can hide myself in the group and I won't be found guilty. And all of those ideas that go along with that. Taking part with many to do evil. Siding with the many in a lawsuit to pervert justice. Here the idea is if you tell the same story often enough, even though it's a lie, people will begin to believe it.
That's right.
And sometimes that happens.
Oh, yes.
So that's a downfall of the false witness. Partiality to the poor in a lawsuit. Now, God, as Scott mentioned just a moment ago, God was very insistent on the fact that the poor be treated equally along with others. They be treated righteously. Just because they're poor and may be defenseless, then they have to get the equal treatment of the guilty in the lawsuit as well. If they are righteous, they get the equal treatment with the righteous. And so there's no partiality because of financial status. And that would apply to the rich as well, wouldn't it? Because all should stand on the same footing before God in any kind of grievance or concern. Care of an enemy's animal. It would have been nice if the Lord could have said, this is who your enemy is. But I think the idea is that this is who I think my enemy is.
Wow.
I'm thinking this guy's against me. I'm thinking he's he's hedged about. He's a rich man, so I'm a poor man, he's my enemy. Or he's a poor man, I'm a rich man, he's my enemy. Or I don't like the way he looks, or he said something that I didn't like, or all of those things, that we think of in our mind, those little petty ideas that we get. So here's this enemy, and his animal goes loose, and you see him. You're not just going to let him just take off. You go get him and take him back to his owner. God knows that there's some things that helps with. First of all, it helps me see that this fellow that I think's my enemy is just a human being like I am. He has a soul just like I do. He has losses and gains just like I do. And here I'm helping him recover a loss. And that helps him see that maybe I'm not his enemy so much. And it may very well be that he didn't have any idea I thought he was my enemy. But you see how that helps human beings work together. We should not rejoice by the loss of our enemy. If a hater's donkey, and I put a hater's donkey there, we understand that terminology, I think. Someone that hates us, maybe has accused us of something. If a hater's donkey has fallen under his load, in other words, he's carrying a load and he's being driven hard maybe, and he collapses under his load, and we see that, we're to stop and help rescue him, help get the donkey up out from under his burden, give him rest, maybe even give him some water to drink or something of that nature, and help him to go on. Because there's no profit to anyone by having a dead donkey, is there? There's no profit to anyone for having an enemy. And so certainly that is the case, and I'm not talking about in dollars and cents, I'm talking about from a spiritual standpoint. Revisiting true speech. We talked about a false witness a moment ago. Truth and justice must prevail even though one party may be poor, as we mentioned a moment ago. No false accusations. Same thing as a false witness. Luke 19 and verse 8. Let's look at that for just a moment. Luke chapter 19, and verse 8. Obviously, you'll recognize this as the gospel, part of the Gospels, and a time when Jesus was on the earth. And in chapter 19 and verse 8. Chapter 19 and verse 8. We come to the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was what? By occupation. Okay, tax collector, that's right. He was a small guy, yeah. We teach the kids to sing the song that he was a wee little man. And so Jesus was going on his way in verse 5, came to the place. He looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. And they have a conversation. He hurried and came down and received him gladly. And when they saw it, they all began to grumble, saying, he has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. So Zacchaeus was an enemy to some, right? Sure. And Zacchaeus stopped, and he said to the Lord, behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much. What does that sound like? Sounds like the law of the sheep, doesn't it? Yes. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. And so in connection with false accusations, he says, if I have defrauded, if I have said to this fellow that he owes X amount in taxes and he did only owe half of that, I'm going to return to him 4 times as much. Jehovah said, do not kill the innocent, for I will not acquit quit the wicked. Same thing in regard to the widow and orphan. If they cry to me, if their blood cries to me, I will hear. Take no bribe. It blinds the clear-sighted. In Acts 24, verse 26, Felix called for Paul often to hear him. He didn't want to become a Christian. He called for him often because he thought that if he kept calling for him, maybe Paul would give him some money so he would turn him loose. So he was involved in bribery there. It blinds the clear-sighted. And again, care for the sojourner. Remember Egypt and how you were a slave and a sojourner there in the land. So now we get to the Sabbath of the land that I mentioned a moment ago. The Lord Jehovah said you can sow and reap the land for 6 years. On the 7th year, you let it lie fallow for the poor to eat from. If you have sown in a field for a number of years, and you let it go fallow, after that, what comes up in the field the next year?
Some seeds just fall into the ground.
Okay. Volunteer, we call it volunteer, right?
Yeah.
We haven't actively planted, but there's still seed in the ground which produces the next year. And so that was left for the poor. The poor had that fallow land, which had some volunteer growth in it, to gather for themselves. Now we're going to learn a little bit later on that the outskirts of the field, like the corners of the field, if you were to be left ungathered for the poor as well. Remember Naomi and Ruth?
Yeah.
How they went out into the field to gather. They were poor, and so that's how they kept alive, as they would go out and reap the benefits of those that left for the poor. And so they said, whatever's left after the poor has gathered, the beasts may eat. So the beasts could eat the stalk, whatever was left, whatever green plant might be left, they would eat that. And then there was the law of the weekly Sabbath, which we've already discussed, but he said you'll have 6 days of labor, rest on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath. The ox and the donkey may have rest during that period of time. The son of the woman's servant may be refreshed. Now, what does that mean exactly? The son of the woman servant. How many days a week is the woman servant working?
All the time.
But how many days? 6. 6. Okay. She was to rest on the 7th day as well. And on that 7th day, her son would have his mother home all day long. And they would be together. And they would have that mother-son relationship. And he would be refreshed, knowing that his mother still loved him and cared for him and was able to be with him because of this law. You see how the Lord takes care even of the servant, even of those that have to work for others. He takes care of those, and he takes care of their offspring. The alien among you shall be refreshed. How many days of the week did the alien work? He worked 6 just like everybody else. And so here he's having this day of rest on this Sabbath, and whether or not he uses that to worship the Lord, he has this day of rest, and he will stay on with you, and you will prosper because of the alien's work. So a number of things that we see concerning the weekly Sabbath. And he says, take heed, pay attention to all that God has said. Titus chapter 1, verse 14. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1. Take heed, be diligent. Understand what the Lord has told us. That has not changed. And we continue to do that to this day because we want to be pleasing to God and obviously receive the blessings that he has promised us. So in connection with other gods, we've seen this twice already, but this is so serious, he says, do not let the name of these other gods fall from your lips. That's how much the Lord despises us worshiping something else besides Him. Do not even let it fall from your lips. So our last slide for this morning, we talked about the yearly feast, and this will get us down through. I've lost my place here. Let me get back to where we're supposed to be. Exodus 23. This will get us down through the end of verse 19. 3 times in a year, feasts were to be kept. There was the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, and what ran concurrently with the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Passover, right. And so that started at 6 p.m. or at sundown. It started at sundown on the 14th day of Abib, which falls somewhere between our March and April. And it was to be kept for 7 days. The first day was a holy convocation to the Lord. The 7th day was a holy convocation to the Lord. And then there was the Feast of First Fruits that we refer to as Pentecost. Pentecost. That was 50 days after the Feast of Passover. And that was the time of the first fruits of harvest. They would take those first fruits and they would offer them up to God. And that began that particular feast. And then there was the Feast of Ingathering or Harvest at the end of the season, and often referred to as the Feast of Tabernacles as well. So this was where they would bring forth the best of the harvest and give it to the Lord in sacrifice to Him. All males of the Israelites were to appear before God at these feasts. So at this particular time, when they were in the wilderness on their way to Canaan, how would they do that? They'd already be there, right? They would all be together. Later on, they had to sojourn to Jerusalem, remember? And that's how Jesus wound up being born in Bethlehem. Because of and that had to do more with, instead of a feast, it had more to do with the census that was taken during that time of year. So we see how all of those things kind of go together. Any further comments or questions before we conclude? Yes, Murphy.
All right, in Matthew 26, verse 59, during the trial of Jesus, Matthew records, now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came in, they found none. At the last there came 2 false witnesses. I'm assuming they're Jewish. And said, this fellow said, I am able to, this fellow said, Jesus, I am able to destroy the temple of God, build it in 3 days. And then Jesus was silent, and the high priest said, do you answer nothing? What is it these witnesses against him? He held his peace. And then he puts him under oath. Tell us whether you be the Christ, the Son of the living God. You have said, nevertheless I say to you, hereafter shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven. High priest tears his clothes. And they say on testimony of false witnesses that Jesus has spoken blasphemy, and they said he's guilty of their Jeremy. This was a thorough violation of the Mosaic law, and yet it was done by the religious leaders.
That's right, it was. And it took a Roman leader and governor to realize that they had lied, and he found no fault in Jesus, but they wanted him crucified anyway. That's right. When evil men do evil things, evil will always be the result. Yes.
I thought on the same thing that Murphy did, but I also thought of what happened with Ahab and Naboth's vineyard.
Yes.
They got false witnesses to state against Naboth that he's done wrong. and he was put to death, and Ahab got that vineyard thanks to Jezebel.
Right.
Right.
Scott?
Oftentimes throughout the Bible, we have God's commands. We don't always get an explanation, we just know we need to follow it because God is wise and I'm not God. Most of these we've studied, makes perfect sense to me. Protect the widows, don't harm people. They kind of all fall under the Ten Commandments, under just love. Kind of like today, how do I know if this is good? Well, does it bring glory to God? So you can go straight to the top. If you're not sure it brings glory to God, just don't do it. Right? Well, there's in chapter 21 and about 20, if a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and they die, he should be punished. If, however, they survive a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for it is his property. That makes my head turn sideways and go, what? That doesn't seem right. So what I need, excuse me. It kind of falls back to the same thing. I don't need to understand because it's God. It's not Jeremy's law. And I would say, wait a minute, God, we need to talk about that. I don't think you're right. What I need to do is say, I don't understand, God understands, and I trust in Him. So if people would simply have that attitude in the New Testament, there wouldn't be so many versions of church.
Yes, right. What if, and all of that.